Both Donald Trump and President Biden took their campaigns to the southern border yesterday, just days ahead of crucial Super Tuesday contests. The pair gave dueling speeches in Texas. They outlined what needs to be done to curtail an influx of migrants crossing into the U.S.
Folks, it's real simple. It's time to act. It's long past time to act. I just received a briefing from the Border Patrol at the border, as well as Immigration and Enforcement, asylum officers, and they're all doing incredible work under really tough conditions. Really tough conditions. They told me what you already know and we already know. They desperately need more resources.
This is a Biden invasion over the past 3 years. I call him Crooked Joe because he's crooked. He's a terrible president, the worst president our country's ever had, probably the most incompetent president we've ever had. But it's allowing thousands and thousands of people to come in.
Leslie Sanchez and Joel Payne join us now with more on this. In This Week in Politics, Leslie is a CBS News political analyst who served in the George W. Bush administration. Joel is a CBS News political contributor, Democratic strategist, and chief communications officer for Move On. Leslie, let me begin with you. Yesterday, the president called for collaboration with the former president on passing border policy. But the question, of course, is, has the situation become so politicized that it doesn't really allow for bipartisanship, but in the Senate, you have seen bipartisanship coming together around this issue. It feels like it's just in the House where there can't be a meeting of the minds.
You know, it's interesting, Vlad. I think you're right on point about how difficult it is to have immigration reform, border security initiatives move forward, because a lot of times you're talking about the dignity of individuals, of undocumented individuals, but it's also a political issue in terms of mass immigration across the borders that is very difficult for Republicans and Democrats to grapple with. Because this is so polarized is not new. Republicans have led immigration reform efforts for the last 3 decades successfully, and I would argue unsuccessfully. Ronald Reagan, when he gave amnesty to Central and South Americans, to 3 million individuals, he was really criticized by the conservative flank of the Republican Party. So there are long memories in Congress that know what happened. I think it's a false statement. It is a false hope for the president to say that this just falls on the heels of Republicans grandstanding, because many of the failures that you see now and the exploitation of the immigration laws are because of Biden's policies that were a swing back and retracting a lot of what Donald Trump had done.
You know, Joel, immigration obviously is divisive across party lines, but even within the Democratic Party, figuring out a way to move forward on this issue has been a bit fracturing. What can President Biden do to actually get the party together around this?
Yeah, Jared, it's a good point. You know, this is a hard issue for President Biden. It's an easy issue for former President Trump, and that kind of plays the form for Democrats and Republicans. Democrats are cross-pressured on this because their coalition is cross-pressured. You have part of that Democratic coalition, independents, who are really concerned about border security. You also have progressives who are really concerned about asylum and fairness and about sticking to our values and reflecting that through our immigration system. So when you have that cross pressure on one side and you have it just coming one-sided from the Republican side, it's an advantage issue for Republicans. Something that I do think is interesting is just that visual of Donald Trump in front of the folks he was standing in front of in that clip that we showed before we started talking, and then Joe Biden in front of the folks he was standing in front of. And I think it's going to be something that we'll see mirrored throughout this election cycle. It'll be the two Americas election, I think, when we look back on it, because you have one America with one president speaking to it one way and another America with another president speaking to it another way. And when we look back at this time, I actually think that might be a clear recollection of what the choices were in 2024.
Leslie, let's talk about the Republican Party, specifically Donald Trump and Nikki Haley. Of course, Trump beat Haley in the primary in Michigan, but she says her vote shows that there's still an appetite for a Trump alternative.
Right, but how much?
Well, so the question becomes, I mean, Donald Trump winning as he did in Michigan, Leslie, strikes me that there is still an opportunity for Nikki Haley to exploit suburban women, for example. It does show that there is a weakness in his constituency, in that he's not able to, yes, he beat Nikki Haley handily, but it's not like he got 70% of the vote.
The interesting part of that question, and I think it's a part Republicans really struggle with, is where does the women vote factor fall into that? So Nikki Haley represents, we talk about that college educated, traditionally white, suburban mom. It was the soccer mom, the security mom. We've called them every type of mom you can imagine, but right now they're the mad mom. Okay, they're the ones that fundamentally feel frustrated at the polarization of both parties. They do not like the policies and the weakness, they would argue, in focus groups of the Biden administration, but they just don't get comfortable with the chaos that surrounds the president. And the alarming part, I would say, is that unless the president really understands that when he is dismissive, for example, of Nikki Haley, or he criticizes her in just such a foul way, that it questions, it really stirs up, I heard one voter say, it just stirs up this notion that women don't deserve to be at the table, and this question of equality. It just brings up a lot of other sentiment and triggers that in a lot of these women. So to your point, unless there is a way of being magnanimous, bringing in these other factions of the Republican Party, Trump is going to have that challenge. Will they go for Biden? I don't believe so.
But wait, Leslie, let me ask you,
maybe.
Isn't it concerning for Republicans that when it comes to South Carolina, for example, about half of the Republicans polled in that contest say that Donald Trump is too extreme to win the general election? Shouldn't that raise alarm bells for Republicans?
I think internally it doesn't. Some would say it's too extreme. The amount of momentum, the fact that this is Donald Trump's party, that they are dismissive and feel that he is unfairly attacked with all the legal lawsuits, all the other efforts. I think it's a wave that is gaining momentum versus conversely, what you're saying is like it's kind of tapping down the engagement. And Super Tuesday is going to decide that. Is the enthusiasm gap, compared to 2020 or 2016, is it flat? That's going to be an indicator of what you're saying is probably true and is a bigger marker on what's going to come in November.
Joe, I want to get one more question into you. So looking at Michigan for President Biden, obviously he won handedly, but there was about 100,000 voters there that said they were undecided or uncommitted in Michigan. And I've also been seeing some of the chatter amongst younger voters, Democratic voters, amongst black Democratic voters, who are saying that they're a bit disillusioned by what's happening with President Biden, in particular with how he's handling the situation in Gaza. What can Biden do to sort of tamp down some of that very loud or increasingly loudening dissent as the campaign moves forward?
Yeah, look, I've heard a lot of debate and discussion about this, both publicly and privately. And I'll just say 100,000 voters ain't nothing, right? It also doesn't tell the entire story. I think it tells a story that there is a chunk of President Biden's coalition that he's got to re-earn and reconvince the vote of. He has to, convince those folks that he will represent their opinions, particularly on this issue related to what's happening in Gaza. I think he has time to do that. I'd say there are two things that I think Biden has to do. One, I think he's got to help be a part of some sort of solution to the situation in the Middle East, probably finding a way to strike a ceasefire, I would say by Mother's Day at the very least. Just to give himself some time to pull that coalition back together. I also think he has to start to maybe adopt some of the language of the movement. He and his White House have been very reticent to use the term ceasefire. They've talked about a humanitarian pause. It's essentially a ceasefire. I think the president and his team are going to have to get comfortable with adopting some of the language and some of the premise that concerned block of voters is talking about. And you're right, it's not just Muslim American voters in Michigan. It's young voters, it's black voters. Frankly, it's a lot of independent voters who don't like what's happening in the Middle East as well. So the president's got some work to do, but the good news is for him, he's got time to do it.
Wait, Joe, before you go, just really quickly. So does that mean when we look at this vote that happened in Michigan, those folks who decided to vote uncommitted, does that mean that come Election Day that they will either sit the election out or perhaps vote for Donald Trump? Because I'm struggling to understand how, if you care about this issue, that you would think that Donald Trump would be better for the issues that you care about, specifically the plight of Palestinians in Gaza.
Yeah, it's interesting. So if you'll remember, when this kind of effort started in Michigan, it was framed a little bit more along the lines of abandon Biden, and it changed to uncommitted, meaning it gave these folks, I think, more of a frame to come back into the coalition. A lot of the uncommitted voters, I don't think, are saying, I will never be for Joe Biden. They're saying, I'm not for Joe Biden right now, and he has to earn my vote. And I'm holding it out there as something that he can bring me back into a coalition. I'm sure there are parts of that coalition or parts of that uncommitted faction that might never come back. I think what the president has to hope, and I think it's true, that he can get enough of those folks back to make himself whole politically.
Always fascinating. Leslie, Joel, thank you so much.